So I'm Chris Warshaw. I'm an assistant professor in the department. I'm going to talk about the intersection of big data and the study of representation. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some of the problems for the study of representation and how some of the unique aspects of MIT have enabled me, along with a number of other co-authors, to overcome some of these challenges, which I think has been really exciting for me over the last couple of years. So there's three big questions that I've focused on in my research, and I think all three of these are at the core of the study of political representation. So one is, what is the impact of public opinion on public policy? If the public gets more liberal, does public policy also get more liberal? The second big question is, what's the impact of elections on public policy? As many of you know, earlier this week we had elections all over the country. How much should you care whether a Democrat or Republican became the governor of Kentucky? In the case of Kentucky, they just elected a Republican for the first time in many years. And the press sort of covered this as a massive event with the implication that public policy is going to shift far to the right because of the election of this governor. But in fact, the empirical research on how much it matters who wins and loses elections is sparse for some reasons I'll talk about in a minute. And the third big question, which I'm not going to focus on too much today, but has been a big focus of mine and some of my co-authors at MIT, is how can we make democracy work better? Can we design institutions that enhance the relationship between elections and public opinion and the public policy outcomes that we get? But the core problem for all of these big questions is that we lack high-quality data. So where big data comes into this is that the availability of more information and advances in our ability to actually make sense of that information, which in many ways is actually more important than the information itself, has really revolutionized the kind of work that we can do to understand how we can make democracy work better. So I'm going to talk about 4 projects that intersect with these big questions and how being at MIT has enabled me to tackle them in exciting ways. So the first question is, what's the impact of public opinion on policy outcomes at the municipal level? So there's been very little previous research on this, in part because we didn't actually know very much about either public opinion or public policy at the local level. To put it simply, we lack data on what the public wants government to do at this level of government. But one of the exciting developments in the discipline over the last number of years, and this isn't MIT specific, but I think it's one of the most exciting developments in political science, has been the development of large-scale surveys with hundreds of thousands of respondents. So what we're able to do is to leverage all of these surveys and combine them to estimate what does the public want in each of these cities. So in more than 1,500 cities across the country, we were able to determine how liberal is public opinion. To make a graph, something like this one, to say that it turns out San Francisco and Washington, D.C. are the most liberal cities in the country, whereas places like Mesa, Arizona, which is sort of a large suburban city in Arizona, is among the most conservative. Now, the reason I could do this at MIT is in part for the reasons that Steve talked about earlier. It's the focus on the big questions. Doing this took several years of work that I think without the support of my colleagues and the culture at MIT to focus on the big questions would have been very difficult. And then we're able to find that it turns out when you actually assemble data on both public opinion and public policy, public opinion, even at the local level, is quite responsive to public opinion. So cities where there are more conservative, or the citizens are more conservative, spend less than cities where the public is more liberal. So the next question, the next sort of related question that I've worked on with colleagues at MIT, and in this case, this project's one of my faculty colleagues, Devin Caughey, is what's the impact of changes in public opinion on state policy outcomes? And like the project on municipal representation, the core challenge for the study of representation at the state level is that it's not obvious how liberal the public was in Mississippi in 1955. So in order to understand how much it matters how liberal the public is, we need to have good estimates of how liberal both public policy and public opinion is at various points in time. So for this project, we worked with a huge team of undergraduates at MIT, which is another huge way that being at MIT has been incredibly important for the research that I've done. And we're able to aggregate information from well over 1,000 individual polls. But in some ways, more interestingly, we aggregated information from over 150 individual policies, or nearly 150 individual policies. And to do this, we had to work with undergraduates that actually understood what all of these policies were about. There's no way that I could myself read about 150 individual policies. The only way to do this was with the amazingly talented undergraduates that we have here at MIT, was what made this project go. And the final piece for this project that was really important is we were able to leverage the computational power that MIT has available. So the model that we used to estimate public opinion going back in time in every state in the country took several weeks to run. And this was on the very large clustered computers that we have at MIT. And without those kinds of computational resources, it would have been almost impossible. And what we're able to find is that as you go back in time, the same states that the public gets more liberal, it turns out the policies also get more liberal. So if you look at northern New England, turns out Vermont was one of the most conservative states in the country in the 1930s and 40s. Here we start in 1965, where they were roughly in the middle of the distribution of states. So as the public got more liberal in Vermont, public policies likewise got more liberal. Whereas in states where the public got more conservative, public policies also got more conservative. The next big substantive question that I focused on with colleagues here is how much does it matter whether you have a Democratic or Republican mayor or governor? In other words, how much, if what we care about is policy, which ultimately is what most of us care about ultimately when we think about government, how much should you care whether the mayor or the governor is a Democrat or Republican? So previous research found essentially no impact of partisanship on policy. But the problem with previous research, it was all based on very small sample sizes. But what we were able to do in this study, and this is working with a terrific graduate student, Justin de Benedictis-Kessner, is build an enormous data set of election outcomes at the city level. In particular, we were able to estimate the partisanship of mayors. And as you may know, most municipal elections in the country are not partisan elections. So the only way to know whether the mayoral candidates are Democrats or Republicans is to look for sort of other proxies for their partisanship. So in this case, we developed an algorithm that really Justin did 99% of the work on to scrape the websites of election information on municipal elections. And in particular, to try to leverage sort of crowd-based research that many other people had done. And we also leveraged another sort of exciting development in the discipline, which is that a researcher at Stanford recently put together a database of campaign finance information of over 15 million people. And based on this information, he estimated the partisanship of those officials and those people, based on sort of whether you gave money to Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or various other candidates. So we merged the information of mayoral candidates to this huge database to figure out in thousands of municipal elections, are the candidates running for office actually Democrats or Republicans, even though they don't sort of tell you they're Democrats or Republicans? And what we found, lo and behold, is that it actually matters a lot whether you elect a Democratic or Republican mayor. And in fact, cities with Democratic mayors spend about $100 per capita more than cities with Republican mayors, which is equivalent to roughly a 6% increase in municipal expenditures. And then finally, the final project, again with my colleague Devin Caughey and Yiching Zhu, focused on the impact of electing a Democratic governor on state policy. And again, for this project, like the project I mentioned earlier, the key problem is that there hasn't been data on state-level policy going back in time. So we worked with a large team of undergraduates to put together a massive database of state-level policies. And what we found, once again, is that it actually matters a fair bit whether you elect a Democratic or Republican governor. But we also found, and this is what Yiching did an amazing job working on, is figuring out that it turns out it matters a lot today whether you elect a Democratic or Republican governor. But prior to about 1990, it basically didn't matter at all. So from the 1930s all the way through about 1990, basically, it made no difference for policy whether you elected a Democratic or Republican governor, which is something that we didn't know before. And once we understand this fact, it sort of has large implications for how we think about the effect of polarization in elections in American politics. But again, all of this work wouldn't have been possible without the support at MIT, both for focusing on the big questions, for the terrific both graduate students and colleagues that I have here, as well as the amazing undergraduates, because in total for these projects, well over 20 undergraduates worked on the data collection and sort of making sense of all this data. And then finally, to make sense of all this data, we needed massive computational power. which is another, I think, unique advantage that we have being at MIT. So thank you.